What is your downright scariest real-life story? Story 1. When I was a kid, I used to sleepwalk. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in Decatur, Georgia, I'd often wake up outside in the dead of night, clueless about how I got there. I'd have to walk back home and face the ominous gate, often left wide open, wondering who might be lurking around. But the scariest incident happened when I was in 3rd grade. I woke up to find myself standing by the window, the curtains pulled back. There, staring back at me, was a large, completely hairless man. No hair, no eyebrows, slowly inching closer, looking really surprised, almost unsure of what he was seeing. It hit me suddenly. Then I let out an uncontrollable scream, frozen in place, with fear causing me to lose control. The man appeared to be freaked out as well, then zigzagged away like he was dodging bullets. My mom was startled awake by the commotion, but just dismissed it as a bad dream. Yet the following morning brought a reality check. We discovered a screwdriver lying on the porch, alongside visible damage to the door jamb and handle. It was a confirmation that the terrifying encounter wasn't a figment of imagination, but a harrowing, tangible event. Wait, did he just scare off the intruder? Oh boy, this poor soul must have a face that only his mother could love. Story 2. I was with this guy for a couple of years when it hit me that he'd adopted illegal substances as a post-work hobby. We already had our fair share of issues, and the 3 little kids in the picture, I reached my breaking point and showed him the door. A few days, maybe a week later, he created a fake Facebook profile and sent me a friend request. But this wasn't the usual social media connection. The page was full of chilling posts about ending my life and that of my children, his acceptance of death, and disturbing plans for that very day. The latest post included a selfie of him in my own backyard, a recent one, confirming his presence there. Late in the evening, while on my way home with the kids, I received this request. The previous day, I had visited my parents' house and retrieved my dad's weapon because he'd been hinting through mutual friends about burning my house down. As soon as we arrived home, I dialed the police. Their response wasn't reassuring. They didn't consider it a serious matter and couldn't spare an officer to check my house before we entered. I lived deep in the woods, with a pretty small police force serving our area, so with no immediate help available, I had to take matters into my own hands. I made the tough call of keeping the kids in the car, briefing my eldest son on what to do in case anything went wrong. Then armed, I swept through my own home in the darkness. It was terrifying. For a while, every time we returned home, I had to meticulously check every nook and cranny, always bracing myself to possibly find him waiting inside. His death threats continued, and my repeated calls to the police eventually led to a restraining order being granted a couple of weeks later. About a year ago, he passed away, and oddly enough, relief was the only emotion I felt. Story 3. It was the early to mid-90s in Northern Ireland, and I was just a kid. The sun beamed down, and it was around early afternoon. My dad had a library book to return to Shankill, a Protestant loyalist area in Belfast. We belonged to the Catholic community. The Shankill held a fearsome reputation at the time, and to some extent, it still does. Naturally, I was a bit on edge just knowing about the place's reputation. However, my dad remained unfazed. He didn't seem worried at all. After all, it's not like we had Catholic stamped on our foreheads. He did warn me to use a different name if anyone questioned me. See, my real name marked me as a Catholic, so for the trip I adopted Protestant name. We reached a road leading to an intersection, beyond which lay a mostly Catholic and Republican area. Our path veered to the right, down a winding stretch. Up ahead near the intersection, a group of men caught our attention. One among them darted back and forth across the road, exchanging information between 2 clusters of people. Some were gazing intently toward the Catholic area, while others talked with a man seated in a parked but idling car. Among them, one figure stood out, a tall man with long hair and a leather jacket. His presence felt out of place, strikingly different from the rest. Even as a child, I sensed something was off, though I couldn't quite grasp why. My dad's demeanor shifted to a more serious and subdued tone, a signal that all wasn't well. He hailed from Belfast, having grown up some of the region's darkest times, so he recognized the signs of trouble brewing. We were walking away from the men, steering clear of any potential problem. Crossing to the right, we hurried along our way. At that moment, a middle-aged woman with short red hair approached us. She zeroed in on us purposely, appearing visibly preoccupied and nervous. Without skipping a beat, she bombarded my dad with questions, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. Her manner set off alarms within me. Fear surged throughout my entire body, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of being discovered. It was similar to a scene from a horror movie, finding oneself in a town where everyone seems part of a cult, desperately trying to blend in while every move raises suspicion, drowning in escalating paranoia. Suddenly, vivid imaginations flashed through my head. As my dad and the woman talked, my sense of hearing started to fade, as if I were underwater. I clung to my dad's hand, struggling to maintain my grip due to the sweat dripping from my palm. I couldn't explain it, but some primal instinct screamed that we were in grave danger. It became evident that she was closely involved in whatever was happening around the corner, managing and scrutinizing the flow of foot traffic, especially that of strangers like us. Considering we were the only ones on the street, her efforts were rather effective. She was aggressively probing for information about us. My dad, however, remained composed, answering her questions without revealing much, effortlessly maintaining casual demeanor. He explained our area as mixed, a blend of Protestant and Catholic, subtly implying a disdain for Catholics without explicitly voicing it. It was a delicate dance, and I was petrified at the thought of having to join the conversation, knowing I couldn't navigate the situation as skillfully as my dad. He clarified he was there solely to return a book, using it as evidence. She returned her attention to me, inquiring about my name, to which I nervously provided the false one. Undoubtedly, she must have sensed the terror in my expression and heard it in my voice. Sensing the tension, my dad swiftly concluded the encounter with a polite farewell, signaling it was time to depart. We walked away swiftly. The woman remained fixed, her stare burning into our backs as we walked away. Glancing back after about 30 seconds, I caught a fleeting glimpse of her heading toward the road where the men had gathered. We turned a corner, finding ourselves atop a steep, lengthy road or path, the library perched at the bottom. The fenced path on one side and houses on the other made it feel like we were descending deeper into danger, with only two choices looming ahead: press forward or risk turning back. As we walked, we noticed that we were being trailed. My dad urged me to sprint ahead and check if the library was open, despite my hesitation. I looked back. It was the man in the leather jacket with the long hair. Heart pounding, I obeyed, anticipating the sound of shots fired with every step. I reached the door, checked it was unlocked, and hurried back up. On my return, I noticed the man in the leather jacket retracing his steps up the road. Though my dad appeared unruffled, there was a certain tension in his gait, as if he hadn't quite relaxed his fists from a recent moment of tension. He assured me we were safe, but there was an air of vigilance about him. I questioned him about the man following us. He explained that he'd sent me ahead to create distance, then turned to confront the follower, prepared for any outcome. He anticipated violence, but as soon as he faced the leather jacket guy, the man abruptly lowered his head, turned, and retreated the opposite direction. My dad kept watch for a few moments before calmly retracing his steps toward me. The events transpired rapidly that afternoon. Within that hour, Michael McGoldrick, a Catholic taxi driver, met a tragic fate in that very street. The ominous feeling of impending doom had been valid, and I had never experienced such profound terror as I did that day. The news broke out about the taxi driver on TV that night. It all clicked. What I had witnessed earlier was the prelude to a and we unwittingly walked into its midst. I could have likely identified both the woman and the man in the leather jacket if questioned by the authorities, but that scenario was out of the question. There was no way my dad would have willingly exposed us to the risks of being witnesses against a criminal group by involving the police. I could truly sense the terror that gripped them as they realized they almost got shanked in Shankle. Do you think their near-miss experience was creepy? Well, that was just the warm-up. Story 6 is about to show you the horrors people are capable of. Story 4. I was serving in the Navy on active duty, stationed aboard a submarine. During a port stay, most of the crew had gone ashore. The night duty crew, including myself, were permitted to bring our kids on board for dinner. As we were halfway through the meal, an urgent announcement blared through the 4MC, the emergency announcement intercom, indicating the presence of light smoke in the engine room, swiftly followed by the dreaded words, "Fire in the engine room." Our extensive training kicked in instantly and everyone sprang into action. Our commanding officer was still on site but topside. Remarkably, one of our senior enlisted personnel swiftly ushered the kids forward, practically tossing them through a hatch to the topside area, where our CO was there to catch and safely set them on the deck. As everyone rushed towards the source of the emergency, I noticed not a single person reaching for a breathing mask. Without hesitation, I grabbed a bunch of them and followed through the hatch. Upon entering, we were met with what seemed like a light smoke engulfing the entire engine room. Strangely, it didn't smell like smoke. It had a sweet taste and scent. It turned out an oil pump had blown, coating the black half of the boat with atomized hydraulic fluid. Just moments before the emergency was announced, someone was about to ignite a torch in the engine room. The timing of the emergency announcement was critical. If it had come even a moment later, we would have walked into an inferno. If for any reason that person hadn't heard the call and lit the torch after we entered, we'd have been engulfed before we could react. Fortunately, everything was resolved without a major incident. We cleaned the oil that coated all the surfaces and repaired the pump, yet it was an oddly surreal experience, realizing how close we came to an entirely different, far more dire outcome. Story 5. During my freshman year in college, my mom's husband had a mental breakdown and planned to harm her. I was recuperating from knee surgery but dashed from my room to assess the situation. My baby brother, a mere toddler then, was present as he was roughing up my mom. I swiftly took my brother out of the room and instructed my other siblings to flee the house and summon the cops. I had to grapple with him to protect my mom, pinning him against the washer and dryer and urging her to leave. I attempted to confine him in their room to secure the house and search for my siblings, but he overpowered me, making his way to the kitchen to grab a knife. His actions seemed aimed at self-harm, perhaps due to the police being called within that brief window. While on the phone with authorities, he made eye contact with me, began hurting himself, and then barricaded himself in the bathroom, perhaps assuming he'd evade arrest by staying put. I can't imagine how I managed to pull him away from her, given his towering 6'3" frame and over 300 pounds. But what frightened me the most was his calmness when he said, "She's cheating on me, so if I can't have her, no one else will." While I was yelling at him. I'm 21 now, yet I still find myself on edge around knives. Not hearing from my mom whenever she's in the house triggers panic within me. Story 6. My childhood best friend had an aunt who embodied genuine sweetness. She was the epitome of a devout Christian, genuinely kind-hearted, always striving to help others. Her spare time was devoted to aiding the homeless when she wasn't fulfilling office duties at her church. Every weekend, she'd hand my friend and me $5 each to clean up cigarette butts in the block, and then she'd treat us to meals and candy. Truly one of the sweetest people one could ever know. Her life suddenly changed when she began dating a man from her church who admired her inner beauty as much as her outer appearance. After a few months in their relationship, he concluded that her display of kindness towards others, especially men, meant she was cheating on him. This was the same kindness that had initially drawn him to her. So how did this ostensibly reasonable man react? He lurked outside her house, ambushing her upon her return from work one day, ultimately ending her life in broad daylight, right in front of her townhouse. He stayed there at the scene with her lifeless form, holding a piece of gut-wrenching evidence in his hands, as he awaited the arrival of law enforcement. His reason? He believed she deserved to suffer from a broken heart just as she had made him suffer. The horrific tale and the subsequent trial made headlines for an extended period. He was sentenced to around 60 years in prison, already quite advanced in age at the time, effectively a life sentence. Some people may seem good, just like that guy. That is, until they break your heart and tear you apart. Feeling a little creeped out? Perfect. I have a lot of creepy tales I've been dying to share with you, so do yourself a favor. Click that like button and hit subscribe right now. You won't regret it. Story 7. For 12 years straight, I claimed this particular spot at my previous workplace. It wasn't official company parking, but the unspoken rule was to leave the closer spaces for customers. So we, the employees, parked at the back of the lot. One morning, I find a dark-tinted caddy occupying my spot, instantly sparking my anger. Everyone knew that was my spot, especially at the early 4 a.m. shift when it couldn't have been any of my usual colleagues. I knew their vehicles by heart. So, a newbie? Or perhaps someone from a neighboring shop in the plaza? Curiosity nagged at me. Surprisingly, it remained there through my lunch break. Throughout my travel home and stayed the following day as I resumed from 1 p.m. until closing time at 9:30 p.m., and even the next day after that. Something about it was unsettling. There was a distinct off-putting odor lingering around it. Given the scorching southern summer, who knew what was cooking inside that vehicle? My dad, a former Marine turned police officer, always drilled into me that if something feels off, it probably is. So reluctantly, I dialed the non-emergency police contact number. I felt foolish, but each time I passed by, that nagging sensation persisted. I found myself stuck, waiting for over an hour before anyone bothered to show up. Frankly, if it hadn't been for my day off the next day, I might have just given up. But stubbornness prevailed. I waited it out, partly because I can be quite petty when it comes to my spot. The police arrived, clearly annoyed, probably used to endless "they can't park here" calls. However, things escalated swiftly once they run the license plate. Suddenly, they're all over me, demanding my information, urging me to contact my manager, questioning about security cameras in the lot and asking if I've touched the car. Turns out the car is tied to an Amber Alert. When they pry open the trunk, they make a grim discovery. Concealed under a blanket, the source of the unsettling smell. She had traveled with an older, controlling, and insecure boyfriend but had bravely decided to leave the relationship. Tragically, her choice led into a nightmare. He drove her across 3 counties, mistreating her, stuffing her in that trunk, and who knows what else, before abandoning her there to meet a horrific end. Never got to know the time of her passing, and that thought still haunts me at times. I wonder if raising a fuss earlier could have made a difference if she could have been saved. So yeah, trust your instincts, even if they seem insignificant. Story 8. We heard a strange groan while hanging out with friends in a dodgy area of Phoenix. Then we noticed someone's soft, exhausted voice crying out for help. Curiosity drew us towards the voice. There lay a man on the ground, his shirt drenched in red with a knife plunged. He was staring straight at us, yet he whimpered and writhed in agony, pleading, "Help me, I'm dying. Please, help." We offered to call for an ambulance, but it triggered an immediate negative response for him, and he said, "No, don't call 911, just help me, I'm going to die." Despite his protests, we dialed for emergency services. Suddenly, in his red-soaked attire clutching the knife, he cursed before fleeing from the scene. Story 9. I went snowmobiling in the woods with my parents' friends and their acquaintances. Disturbingly, some psycho had rigged an iron wire across the trail, stretching it from tree to tree. The sled just ahead of mine was speeding at around 60 miles per hour. Their sled, along with their bodies, hurled forward until crashing off the trail. Meanwhile, their crowns, still encased in their helmets, remained behind in the snow. This harrowing tragedy took place in Maine. Living life on the edge is like this snowmobile ride. It feels so exhilarating until it's cut short. Story 10. When I was in 5th grade, I was left home alone. Just as I drifted into sleep, someone attempted to force their way through the front door. In a panic, I dialed 911 and sought refuge in the pantry, squeezing onto the bottom shelf. The intruder moved to the door beside the pantry, trying to breach that entrance as well. By the time the police arrived, I was petrified. One of the officers lifted me up, cradling me until my mom arrived. I clung tightly, and he ensured it felt secure. I'm now 27 and I've avoided staying home alone since then. The day I signed the lease for my first apartment, I adopted a dog to keep me company. Experiencing such terror at such a young age leaves a lasting trauma. Story 11. I was exiting a grocery store in Vermont back in '99 when I crossed paths with a young couple, probably in their late 20s, accompanied by a toddler and a baby. They were engaged in a loud argument, but I opted to steer clear, minding my own business. As she began to walk away, the squabble seemed to cease. Disregarding the situation, I proceeded to drive off. Then, the chilling sound of 4 or 5 shots shattered the air. The despicable guy had taken the lives of his wife and children before ending his own. The haunting memory of what I witnessed still plagues my dreams. Story 12. I was alone at home. Fortunately, my kids were not there, when my ex-husband's dealer showed up. He barged in, screaming at the top of his lungs, threatening to harm all of us. Hiding in my walk-in closet under blankets, I dialed 911. He came dangerously close several times, and I have never felt such sheer terror in my entire life. The police arrived swiftly, and he fled. They managed to arrest him just a few streets away. Story 13. A few years back, while I was still living with my mom in Philly, someone attempted to break into our house. Peering through the window beside the door, I locked eyes with 2 men wearing ski masks. One held some kind of pipe or tool, while the other aimed a weapon straight at me. I sprinted away from the door, revving my dad's 10-gauge weapon and positioning myself at the bathroom doorway while dialing 911. They fled and were caught by the police further down the road. They had multiple warrants for break-ins in Maryland and Delaware. One of those incidents had left a father of 2 hurt in the spine and paralyzed. I'm eternally grateful that I came out unscathed from that terrifying situation. Story 14. I attended therapy sessions with my first husband. Throughout, he relentlessly criticized me, painting me as a bad wife. When I finally voiced my desire for him to cease hurting me during my turn to speak, he wasn't pleased. The therapist then requested a solo session with me. Later, my ex-husband demanded to know what I discussed with the therapist. Frankly, I can't remember my exact words. Upon returning home, he confiscated my keys, pager, and glasses and tried to log me in the bedroom. He even cut off access to the landline. After 2 attempts, I managed to flee, taking only what I could fit into my car. That was over 20 years ago, yet I still have nightmares. He repeatedly threatened that if I ever left, he'd track me down. I'm so relieved I escaped. Story 15. Years ago, during one of my early jobs, a colleague shared with me her story. The previous night, after having a few drinks, she hopped out of the bus and headed down her street toward home. A taxi pulled up beside her and the driver urged her to get into the car. Of course, she refused. But then the driver insisted, "Call whoever you need, but please, just get in. I'll explain." Reluctantly, she complied. As she settled in, she learned the unsettling truth. Approaching her was a shirtless man barefoot and holding a machete. The cab driver had already alerted the authorities, but upon spotting my colleague, stopped to ensure her safety. Lucky for her to meet a taxi driver with such a sharp sense of urgency when it came to cutting through danger. You've just reached the end. If you want to watch something even scarier, then go check out What's the Creepiest Story You Read Online That Claims to Be True? Story 3 will make your blood run cold. See you there.